Say good morning to everybody.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks, Josh. Well, welcome everyone. It's good to see everyone here. I don't have a lot to say other than I know this has been a long time coming to have a kind of a contracting and procurement training just for conservation districts, and something I've wanted for a long time myself, and Josh was kind enough to really offer to take it on for us, and we're just really thankful for that. And I know, just through the time I've worked on stuff like this, we're a little different than a lot of other folks that are in this as a regular work. So it's often been something that we know has been needed. It's taken us a while to get going, but again, thanks so much to Josh for putting this together for us. It's going to be a great day today, great morning tomorrow with the Q&A and such, and we'll have breaks throughout the day. We're not going to probably do like formal introductions this morning because we have so much we want to get through, but please take time during breaks to mingle, get to know Josh, introduce yourself and such. Again, we're just really grateful to have this opportunity here to do that today. So, and if it turns out good, hopefully we can maybe do this type of thing again in the future and go from there. So that's what I've got. We'll have lunch around 12:30 and it'll be a great couple days.
All right, thank you, Mike. So let's give Mike a hand. He did a lot of work in putting this together. Thank you, Mike, for your partnership this year and setting all this up. So as I mentioned, Josh Klika, procurement and contracting consultant at MRSC. So I've been in my role about 2 years now. So a little bit of background about me. I started about 20 years ago in government. So I've worked at the state, I've worked locally, I've worked at a city. So I had a little bit different perspectives, all the different pieces of procurement. So I, want to, connect with all of you today about this space of procurement. So this is going to be a 2-day session, as we mentioned. So today is really going to be focused on the different type of procurement projects you're going to see at your organization. And then all the different considerations that you may have as you look at those different project types. Day 2 is going to be more informal. So I'm going to check in at the end of the day about some thoughts I had for day 2 and then get some feedback about what that can look like for you in day 2.
You have one up.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Sorry about that. I always know. But I wanted to mention that Klika is so kind to coordinate recording this day today as well. We'll be able to make available for everyone as well. And also, neglect to say again, if you haven't had a chance to get the handouts, that's how this is going to be. Please do so. We need to have a record. Sorry about that, Josh. Thanks.
No worries, Mike. So we talked about, Mike mentioned, conservation districts are a little unique. So when you look at your RCW, really open-ended, right? Your bid thresholds, none. Established it by policy. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit in our session to really see when it says none, what does it look like at your conservation district when it's open to that? Like, how are you putting that together? So we're going to have a chance to look at that and also see what your peers are doing. Now, the conservation district, and I think Mike had brought some copies of that here. I'd worked with Mike earlier this year to take a look at that conservation district, and we refined it in this last year. And what we had done in there is we went through and tried to summarize some of the sections and make it a little more format friendly to read through all the different project types. But I start there with the conservation guide because we looked at the RCW where it's really open to how you do your policies and how you go out to market for your different projects. And so within that conservation guide on page 3 is a list of expectations. And so I've summarized them here. So I kind of, these are really the 10 things you have to look at regardless of your project type. Everything from making sure you're being ethical, making sure they're responsible, and we'll talk about what that means based on your project type. Looking at having a competitive process, making sure that you've looked at how are you being cost effective. Cost effective can mean many things. And then, making sure that you're answering questions and resolving disputes when they occur. So all those pieces go in all the different projects. We're going to touch on all those different elements today. So keep all those expectations in mind as we looked at the projects. So in today's session, we're going to look at the way we break out the different types of things that we do at a conservation district. So you've got materials, supplies, and equipment that are not related to a public works project. You got public works projects, services, and there's different unique types of services that we're going to discuss today. And then there's intergovernment procurement, which is commonly known as piggybacking. And then there's exemptions to where you don't have to follow a competitive process that are in statutes. We're going to talk about all those things as well. So know as I talk about all these different project types today, after each one, I'm going to pause and make sure I can address any specific questions you have on those project types. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to assign Mike, if when we get to those sections, I may hand this mic off to you so we can get some questions from the audience. And then I'll use the other mic to respond back. That way everyone can hear the question and then I can give some responses. Now, if it's something that may be a multi-layered question, I'll let you know that and maybe need to follow up, and I can always do that after the session if it's not an easy multiple choice answer. So as I mentioned, this will be conversational. We'll take breaks throughout as well. So we're not sitting through a whole format of different project types without getting up and moving around a little bit so you have a chance to network too. Because one of the things I've seen great in these in-person sessions is it's a great opportunity to sit down with people that you may not have a chance to interact with otherwise, even in your own organization. So it's another great thing about being here in person today. So let's start this party today with materials, supplies, and equipment. So what we're going to talk about is what do we mean when we talk about materials, supplies, and equipment? Because each definition is a little unique about what that means. We're going to talk about how you get to the costs, and then we're going to talk about the thresholds, what different entity types are doing here in the room. We're going to talk about the different ways you can go to market, and then throughout each of these different pieces, I'm going to talk about what's unique about the different things that you have to consider. So materials and supplies, really when you look at the definition of that overall, it supports the purchase or work that you're doing, and it's consumed as part of the end thing that you're going out to market for. So think it's the nuts and bolts of any project. It's a material and supply that goes into that final product. Equipment is the thing that does the work for you, and it's not part of the finished project. So it's the thing you're going to do to build something. Putting costs together for these, one thing you have to think about in this goods and equipment space, if it's a one-time need or a like item that's going to be purchased. And there's some different things you have to think about in that determination. And you have to include the sales and use tax in that total cost to get to that total bid limit. So when I say like kind items, what that means is it's items like furniture, tires, and uniforms that you may purchase in bulk. So how you get to that is it's at the time the need exists. So you have to use your best judgment as, hey, I know this is going to happen. And the rule of thumb is think of it as a fiscal year. That's how you make that determination of a like kind item. And recommendation I have here in your policy, maybe address that into your policy as, hey, when we get the like kind items, this is how we're going to do it. That way you have a certain method, because there's different ways you could get to that. But it is good to have it out there so you can be specific about how you get to that total dollar amount when you have a situation where it could be something you may buy more than once. So if you determine that estimate, how do you buy it? Now, this is our first chance to interact today. So in the conservation guide, there's a recommendation of how you go to market for your equipment and materials and goods. Now we say this is just a recommendation because that, in policy, you get to set it at your conservation district. These are the recommended thresholds that are out there. Now what I'm curious about, because if I asked Mike before this session, there's about 21 different conservation districts in the room today. So this is kind of we call it a social experiment. I don't know what your conservation district does based on these recommendations, and neither do your peers possibly. So I want to find out, what are you currently doing around equipment, materials, and supplies? What are the dollar limits? Are there different levels where you do different competition? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Mike to help me here. I've got a handout. And so we're going to pass these out to the tables. And here's what I want you to do. I'd like you to write your first name on there and which conservation district you represent, and then what your limits are. So you might have to phone a friend or maybe look online and access these things. You may not know your limits off the top. That's okay. Give me what you know, because I'm going to take all that information. I'm going to bring it back and share it out so we can all see kind of what does that look like for your peers? How consistent is it? So let's take a couple minutes and do that. Let's take about 5 minutes, put that together, and then I'm going to share that back. And I can take a couple of those too, Mike. I can pass them. Miguel, thank you for the help.
I know.
And if there's any questions on filament, I'm going to walk around as we're putting that together. So I'll roam around a little bit. Great. This is looking at not like public works or services, just like your regular equipment and things like that. Like, what are the dollar limits?
Some other description of equipment, material, supplies, but by tires,
Gotcha.
like,
Like office supplies, anything that wouldn't be like a public works project or a service. It's like
Okay.
physical goods.
okay,
It's a great question.
what about like we buy a car?
Yep, that'd be within that too. Yeah, anything like it would be considered equipment. So yeah, if you had to buy something that was a physical good that wasn't part of a public works project, you may not have it specific in policy too. This was just a check to see if that was. Just curious how everyone's doing that. So just as a clarification, just for everyone, they ask, if you're looking at what do I mean when I look at this particular one, equipment, materials, and supplies could be things like office supplies, furniture, anything that you're not doing as a public works construction project. That's a physical part of things you're using in your office. Carpet, all those different types of things. And just take your best guess. This was just an experiment to see what does it look like at your different conservation district. And the intent of my exercise is just to see how unique it is across conservation districts. So just take your best thought on that. And I can already tell by my quick glances across at the different tables, there are some unique pieces based on the conservation districts. This is great. All right, how's everybody doing? Show of hands, everybody got most of their input in there? Everyone good? Need a couple minutes? All right, quick show of hands. Anyone need a couple more minutes? Okay. Mike, if you could help me go around and gather these up. I'm going to start on this end. If you could start on that end, Mike, I'm going to gather these up. All right, thanks everybody thank you. Put your name in which I'm going to try to track which ones. Thank you. Yeah, I'll just ask if I. Thank you. He's all right here. Thank you. Oh, gotcha. Yeah. All right.
I made a mess of mine. So
Yeah, that is okay. If I need to clarify, I totally can. Thank you. All right, thank you, everybody. So since I made you do a little bit of homework, I'm going to do my part now and do a little homework and consolidate these real quick and share them back out. So if you could, this is our first quick break. If you could give me 5 minutes, I'm going to compile all these and share them back with you. So I'm going to pause here for just a minute and I'm going to put all these together. And if you guys want to grab a cup of coffee, get that second cup, get up. And I forgot to mention too, the restrooms, if you need to use them, straight out this door to the right. So I'm going to take like 5 minutes, compile all these, and then I'm going to share them back with everybody so we can see what does it look like across the conservation district. Thanks, everybody. So here's what I see in here. When we look across, quite a few of the conservation districts are along with the recommendations of the conservation guide. So these are the list of the conservation districts that are using the 10, the 40, and 40,000. Now, one of them looks like the highest threshold we see at the formal competitive where you go full bid, 300,000. So Grays Harbor Conservation District. Who's here from Grays Harbor Conservation District? It's like right back there. A couple folks. So curiosity question. So I'll let Mike get the microphone over to you. Now, I have a theory of why it's 300,000. Right, that would make sense. That's what I was thinking too, because at the time the small works limits were at 300. Now they moved up to 350, but I could see where that connection was in that. So just so it was in alignment on the dollar limits. Okay. Let's see. So the other one that was of interest here, I mean, there's quite a few here. So part of this was just a understanding to see across your peer, districts here, what are the different ways people are going to market for this type of project. The other one is, so JCCD, is that, which conservation, just Jefferson County. Couple of questions, I had a question for you if Mike could bring them. Oh, okay. Yeah. So it might actually be around 10 to 40. Yeah, okay. The only thing that stuck out to me was that it was a little bit lower than the recommendation. So I was just curious of what the thought process was. So, okay, no worries. What I can do too, Mike, if you want, I can send this out afterwards. You can just see kind of what different, people were looking at as far as dollar limits, because maybe looking at this, it may make sense to look at what are some of these dollar limits. Does it make sense, for instance, to align it with the small works? So it's one limit. So that was just my thought too, not knowing what every district was doing. Let's see what it looks like. So a little bit of a preview. I'll just tell you in advance, when we get to the services section, I'm going to ask you to do the same. So I want to see, is there consistency there, different project types? Are you doing different dollar limits? We're going to do a similar exercise. And I know from my learning on it, I can't do a spreadsheet with multiple conservation districts in under 5 minutes. I challenged myself. I got close. I couldn't do it in 5 though. All right. Thanks everybody for, participating with me and letting me do that. So I'll clean that up a little bit and send it out after the session, which conservation districts are doing, in case you want to check in with some of them too and get some insight of why their limit may be a little different than yours. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and transition out, and I'm going to turn this one off, and I'm going to take the handheld back. All right, I'm going to get my PowerPoint back up here. See how quickly I can do that. Yep, I want to see my desktop there. It's crazy. All right, so we just went through all the limits there based on, where you're doing informal, where you may use a vendor list, and what that formal I call it going out to the world looks like. Let's talk about what is the specific pieces as you do those different levels. So the minimal is that it's below your bid limit, and you can see quotes a couple different ways. You can go direct. Now, I only say email and phone. I just couldn't put fax on there. I don't know, is anyone still using fax? Okay. And then you can also use a vendor list. So that's another way you could do that. And we'll talk about vendor lists here in just a moment. So if you do a vendor list, that's a process you can adopt in through RCW. Right now, is show of hands, anyone using a vendor list right now? What's
Does
that?
that include, like,
So that's a good question, a good clarification. So the question was, is it small works roster? Now, if you use MRSC rosters, there's a couple of different rosters. There's a vendor roster, a small works roster, and a consultant roster. So it doesn't look like there's a lot of people in the room that are doing a roster, but that is a process you can do. And so basically you adopt it in by resolution, and then you have a procedure for getting quotes. You'll put in how many, how you're going to go out doing that, whether it's, 3 to 5, however you obtain those quotes. And then you advertise that you have the vendors. So as the question came in, MRSC does host a vendor roster to do that. Now, the interesting thing when you're using a vendor roster, where you have the latitude as a conservation district, is how you add vendors to that roster. So you can host your own roster or use like the MRSC program, but you as the conservation district have some latitude when you're using a roster process of how the vendors get added. And here's what I mean by that. The latitude you have is when I've got a roster project and I put it out, I have latitude to let the vendors either one, bid on it if they're already on my roster, or I'm going to allow them to add themselves to the roster to bid. So I bring that up because that's a clarification. If you adopt a roster into your policy, you want to have something in your policy around how you're going to do that. Because what I have seen is when you're using a roster process, whether it's a small works, a consultant, or a vendor, undoubtedly at some point in time, you're going to have a bid out there and there's a business that's going to go, hey, I'm not on the roster right now. Can I go ahead and get on the roster and bid on the project? So you want to think about that ahead of the time, how you want to do that. Because if you don't have it in policy, you have to make that decision on the fly. So one thing I want to point out there, because it also applies to the small works too. And so when we're doing like that next level up, that informal competitions, that next level up, if we call it based on that other dollar limit from 10 to 40, that's where you've got the vendor list and you're going to request at least 3 quotes and you're going to award it to the lowest responsible bidder. And then those quotes have to be recorded, open to public inspection, and then available by phone inquiry. So what a lot of people do is they'll just post them, the results on the website. So we have to wait for a phone inquiry to show those. So you've got the lower limit under 10, essentially. You've got the 10 to 40 or whatever your limit is. And then we're going to do what we call leveling up to that formal limit. And that's where you go out to the world with your competition. So there's a couple pieces that are recommended when you do that. You at least need to advertise once in your local newspaper or where you put all of your projects out. You want to advertise no less than 13 days. I say no less. Now, this is a Josh recommendation. 13 days is a minimum at that because that's a very small amount of time to have someone get you pricing on something. So 13 days is a minimum. That's a standard that we use at MRSC because in some entity statutes, 13 is the identified days. So that's only a minimum. And then asking for sealed bids when they're formal out to the world is another recommendation to have there so that you're not looking at them until the bid due date. We also recommend you do a public bid open, formal competition like that. So you're reading those all out and then it's awarded to the lowest responsible bidder. And that's the bidder that meets all the criteria that you specified as requirements for that project. Now, those are the 3 limits that are the standard ones, right? You've got your informal vendor list and this formal going out to the world. In statute, there's a separate competitive process that's out there that conservation districts can look at doing. And that's the data processing and telecommunications equipment statute. That's RCW 3904-270. Now, what that does when you have those type of projects is you don't have to do, the low bid type of award. This is where you use the RFP, request for proposal process, where it's a mix of cost and non-cost factors. And so within that statute, that allows you that opportunity to do this alternative process, where it's like a competitive negotiation. So I always point that out because that's just something else in statute that you can look at for these type of applicable projects. What it looks like is Now, this is in statute. I mentioned that 13 days. This is one of those statutes that has that 13 days listed in it. And you identify your evaluation factors, including the price in that RFP. And then you basically don't do just a little bit. It's who's ever the most advantageous to your organization. So basically, you're going to negotiate that too. It's an RFP, so you have that ability to do negotiations on who you award that RFP to. Now I'm going to pause. I'm going to go back for this second. Now, one of the things to think about when you're doing this data processing and telecommunications equipment type process, keep in mind why you're using it, maybe even for equipment. Once you have an installation component within that, like, a lot of IT stuff may have like fiber optic cables or something you have to install. Once you have some installation involved in it, you may be into that prevailing wage and public works type project. So I always point that out because a lot of questions come up around this when you're doing this process. While this is an alternative process to go to market, it does not exempt you from all the public works requirement when your project requires that. So you may have some prevailing wage requirements and retainage, all those pieces that would go into a normal public works. You can still go through this process. You just need to include that into your bidding and contracting process. In this space of your projects for equipment, supplies, and materials, the consideration to have when you're going to market is name brand specification. You can do that when you're going to market for these types of products and projects. And the way you do it is you include it in the bid specs. And you also want to have some clear documentation of why you decided, hey, it's only this one type of thing that I can go to market for. Because undoubtedly, I always say, always have that in advance. You may even want to put it in your bid document, because if you don't, those bidders are going to ask why. So I always have that in the background to know. And I always suggest putting it in your bid doc. So that way you don't have to send out a clarification or anything like that when the question does get asked. Now, the one thing to think about on this is if you're using federal funds, there's unique language in the federal funds, in the federal requirements, that they have to allow for an allowance for equal product to be offered. So standard without federal funds, you can just ask for a name brand. But once you have federal funds involved, you have to allow for that equal to be at least offered to you. Now, when that happens, the question is, well, how do I know whether that equal is going to meet my needs? Well, you're going to want to describe the performance and other requirements that you want from that piece of equipment. So that way it's still able to have a competition, but you just want to say, this is a brand name, here's what it does. Here's the requirements of what this product needs to do if you're going to offer an alternative. And what I've seen entities do in this case is they'll also add languages on how they're going to make that determination. So we'll have a, stakeholder committee that'll do a, approved or non-approved. So they'll even give in the process of how that's going to happen if you do this, allowing equals to be submitted within your bid. So that's only if you want to specify a certain type of equipment. So that's a unique thing you can do, but that's the pieces to consider around that. The other piece, I touched on it a little bit when we talked about that alternative process for the software. But you have to think about if your equipment or products are part of a public works project, you're building something and you need equipment to go along with it. You don't have to do it as supplies and equipment. You want to include those costs in the public works project itself. And then that total dollar limit will set that limit for the public works project. So you don't have to separate equipment out. You can just do a bid for public works, including the equipment if it's part of that project. So right now I'm going to pause because the public works consideration gets us into the public works space next. I'm going to cover that, but I want to pause for questions first when we talk about just goods, equipment, and supplies. I know I saw a couple of hands come up as I was talking through, so I'm going to pause there for a moment, hand the mic to Mike here, and I'm going to turn this on. Yeah, you can absolutely do that. One thing I recommend is if you're going through the roster, the first thing you want to do is see, do you have anything in your policy? Oh, sorry. Yep. So the question that was asked was, if I'm using a vendor list process, for instance, I'm using the MRSC vendor list, can I let businesses know that I'm using that process so they can add themselves to be able to bid on my project? And the answer is yes. Well, what you'll want to do is make sure in your policy you haven't had anything that limited that they be on the roster at the time the project is bid. So you want to make sure that is not there. Now, if it's not, what you can do is you can put a project out and then send a notice out like, hey, I'm going to market for this thing and here's how you can turn in a bid. Here's a link to the rosters you need to be set up. So yes, you could totally do that. It's a great question. Great question. So minimal competition. It says, getting quotes is not required, but it's recommended. That really is something you can set in policy. And the reason it's only recommended is you may want to get 2 to 3 quotes on something informal, right? You're just going to call someone up and ask for pricing. So a lot of different entities like cities will do that. We'll just set in policy like, hey, if we're going to do informal, we're not going to do full submit me costing. I'm going to at least call and get at least 2 cost comparisons, essentially. So I at least want people to test the market before just going to one provider. So that's why that's open to interpretation if you want to at least test the marketplace. So the questions around the vendor list and the benefits and how that process happens. So I'll talk about using the vendor list first. So to do the vendor list, as I mentioned, you have to adopt it by resolution. You only have to do that once. You basically have to put the process in at your conservation district. So you do the resolution, you file it that says, yep, we're adopting in this process. To me, what I see the benefit of that is you already have these entities that are signed up to do business with you. They want to provide work out to you. They've already signed up to be on your roster. They got a business license. They're already set up to work with you. And, going into the open market under certain dollar limits, it doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes to do a whole formal, if you have a formal process in place where you're going to do an advertisement, formal bid opening, under certain dollar limits, you want just straight price quotes. And I say the other benefit of a vendor list versus calling people up is within that dollar limit where you've got that vendor list, let's say it's 10 to 40. This is what most people are doing. You want to formalize it enough to be able to do a straight across price comparison to get your best cost for it. So that way, if you do ask them to put quotes in, you can really do that analysis to really see, did they get all the components I asked for? So you're doing a step further than just going over the phone in that case. You're putting together a bid document because there's probably some elements to that project. And it usually, because the cost went up, there's more pieces to it that I make sure that this business has covered when they give me that product bid. Did that cover that for you? Okay, that's a great question. Thank you for asking for the clarification on adopting in that process. And I'll also add, if you're adopting in a rosters process, at the end of the conservation guide, there's some examples of how you put one of those resolutions in place. So there's a sample there, and also on our website, we have a sample doc that you could go and pull up to and do that. So those templates exist for you, so you don't have to start from scratch. Do we have any other questions about the materials and supplies? We have a couple more here in the room, and then I'll check the online too. I'm going to say yes, because you always want to see if they're set up to do business in the state, because they're going to have possibly some tax requirements. My recommendation is always make sure that they're licensed to do business in the state of Washington, that they're set up as a corporation. So there's ways you can check that. You want to make sure that they've registered as a business in the state. Yeah, I think you still want to make sure that they're set up as a business. Yep. So I'm going to do the history there with Mike. So I'll reiterate the question for online. The question was like, for the recommendations that are in the conservation guide, what's the background on how those limits were established?
I'll do my best.
Absolutely. That was my intent too coming into this session, because what I didn't know coming in too is what were the conservation districts doing around these limits, even though there's some recommendations, have people over time adjusted them up based on inflation or down. And so what it looks like there are, for the most case, there's some districts that have adjusted them up. And I think half the districts here are represented today. So it might spark conversation within your organizations and groups when you get together in the future to look at, hey, if we want to make a standard recommendation across the board, does that need to adjust? And if so, yes, we would work together with the team to adjust in what our recommendation is in the guidebook too. If as a group you decide, hey, at a standard limit, here's where we want to start, we could totally reflect that in the guide. Yeah, I think as far as like services too, I'm going to talk about services specific as one section. In general, I'd say, yeah, you'd want to go through that process because it's a supply now? Is that because it's not really part of a public works project, so it's a product, and basically you could say it's a piece of equipment or it's a supply that you're using, right? Now, what you may want to look at in policy is there are certain things you're going to exempt from competition. That may be something you look at. Now, if you're going to exempt things, that's where you'd be specific. Things like plants. I know in some aspects, things like newspapers, magazine subscriptions, memberships, those are things that can be exempted in your policy. So maybe there's certain categories you exempt from competition. Yeah, that's an opportunity you could look at doing for sure. Yeah, so I shook my head there, but I know people online. So the answer is yes, like a boat and things like that would be considered equipment because it's a physical, I always look at it's a physical product, right? It's a tangible item. And so yes, if it's not part of, because I think, yeah, if it's a piece of equipment, a supply, something physical, it falls into this goods, equipment, supply category. And so it'd follow the bid limits that you'd have at your organization for that. Okay, so the question was, at what point does the bid threshold not matter? And I think the scenario you're saying is you go out to market, you follow the bid limits, but then you get no responses back. Yep. So when that happens, the first thing is if you followed your process and gone out and it has evidence of competition, so you've already shown that you've followed your guidelines that go out to market. So that's the first thing that you can check. I've done that. Now what you'll want to do is have a process in place, and what you may want to do is mirror what's in statute for cities, because they have in their statute what happens when no bids are received. And basically what happens when no bids are received is they can decide, do they want to go back out to market again, make a second call for bids, or do they decide I've got evidence of competition, I'm now just going to pick a provider and negotiate an agreement. So that's one of the things you can look at adopting a policy of, if I follow my competition processes, here's what we do next. Now, the other piece I'll add in is kind of the one that's not in statute, but I'll give you a scenario. So let's say my competition was within like that vendor list process, right? I didn't get any bids. One of the other options I could decide is I may want to level up and now go out into the open market. I may want to go out and expand out my competition. So that's kind of that hybrid of going out for a second call. I may not just use the vendor list again. I may now go out full market to see if I can expand out my reach, see if I get bids back. Because there might be a value in not just picking a provider, but if it's where I feel like I can negotiate some value, I may want to go out to a wider marketplace, get some more competition. Yep, I think there's a clarifying question right here, Mike. If it's not federal money, those are not attached. Because if it's from state of Washington, it's yeah. So you could, if it's within like that, let's say it's within that informal or just seeking quotes like a vendor list or doing that, you could just, if you were doing the right amount of quotes, you could use them because basically they're going to give you pricing. Now, if it's full formal, you're basically going to go out to the world anyways, and anyone that you're going to give notice to is going to bid it. But I think in your scenario, the important part is, yes, you're being brand name specific, but you can let anyone that carries that piece of equipment provide you costs back. So you're having competition occur, getting the best price for it. I think there's a clarifying question here. Well, I think where the business license comes in is, as far as like verifying you're making payments correctly. So in an honorarium, it's a little unique because it's very low dollar. And I'm going to actually do a little research of what we recommend on those. Because generally I say most times you want a business license regardless of the dollar amount, because through your accounts payable process, you want to make sure that you're paying an entity that's set up to do business in the state. And so I will get a fine line if there's any distinction on the honorarium part as a follow-up. I don't right now believe there is, but I will follow up and see what our guidance has been in the past on that. So I'll make a note on that one. Yep. Okay, good to know. I'm going to make a note real quick. Yeah, I'll get some clarification on that. I have a finance consultant I work with that I'm going to ask him about that and see what his thoughts are. I think so, but I think one of the fine line distinctions there as far as on the accounting side of that, like, are there any considerations on that? So that's why I think I'm going to check in with my finance consultant on what the recommendation would be in those type of scenarios, as far as like payments and whether they really should be an entity that's signed up to do business in the state. I'll see if there's any kind of good approach to that, or consistent approach would be the word I'd go for there. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, yep. So the clarification on that was under a certain dollar limit, they're required to do a W-9. So I think there is some tie-ins to that. That's why I was gonna go and research that and see what the recommendations are. So thank you for sharing that. Because that specific question gets me out of my knowledge space too. When we start talking about the finance and all the requirements as far as payments going out. So that's why I was gonna phone a friend on that one to get some more info. So thank you.
One thing, Josh,
That's a great clarification, Mike. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit later today when we talk about piggybacking on other contracts, because yes, in this supplies and equipment space, many times, even though it's over your bid limits, that's the checklist item. You can look and see, hey, is there a cooperative contract I can utilize? And I'm going to tell you why, you're going to do that consideration of my time into going out to market for that. And does it make sense? Is this cost comparable? So we're going to touch on that a little bit this afternoon about the things you need to think about if you're going to take a path of doing something like going through a state contract. And then Dan, is there any online questions I need to address? Great. All right, so show of hands, do people need a break before we get into public works? Anyone, because I know we took one early on. Anyone just want to jump into public works? And we'll go to lunch, yeah? All right, let's do it.